Good evening, I'm Tony Jones. Welcome to Q&A. Here to answer your questions tonight, Christian ethicist and historian John Stackhouse, Queensland Labor frontbencher Terri Butler, British journalist and TV host at Al Jazeera English Mehdi Hasan, writer and radio host Rachel Corbett, and Minister for Resources and Northern Australia Matthew Canavan. Please welcome our panel. Our Q&A is live on ABC TV and radio at 9:35 Eastern Standard Time, and you can stream us live on iView, YouTube, Facebook and Periscope. Well, as we go to air tonight, there's been a protest outside the ABC studios against the giant Adani coal mine proposed for northern Queensland. Well, one of the people working on the Stop Adani campaign submitted a question earlier today. That's where we'll start tonight. It's from Nell Schofield.
Thanks. Yeah, the question's to Matt Canavan. The Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility, or NAIF, is deciding whether to give $1 billion of our taxes to an Indian billionaire, Gautam Adani, to build a rail line to transport his low-grade thermal coal to the coast, about 400 kilometres, for export. There are also a couple of really exciting renewable energy projects that are in the final stages of NAIF consideration. So why are you so publicly gung-ho behind Adani's, dirty old coal-fired power station and rail project instead of these really exciting future positive projects?
Matthew Canavan.
Well, thanks, Tony. First of all, I am fully supportive of those renewable energy projects as well. I believe we do need to look at all types of energy, not just for this country, but for the world. And you ask why? Why am I gung-ho? And I am gung-ho to support a massive project in this country. And the main reason I am is because the people of that area want it. The Indigenous peoples met last year in a small Queensland town of Maryborough and voted 293 to 1 in favour of the mine. They want the job opportunities for their traditional lands and their peoples. The people of North Queensland overwhelmingly support this mine. And in reference to the loan itself, which is still under consideration, it's important to stress that it is a loan, it's an investment, not a subsidy. And just north of here, about 200 kilometres north of here, is the largest coal export terminal in the world, the Newcastle port. And the Rudd government in 2008 invested $1.2 billion in that rail coal network as part of the stimulus package. You don't hear about it because it wasn't as disastrous as the pink bats or school halls. It worked. It was a really good investment.
Can I just interrupt? Does it give you any second thoughts at all that the four big banks have refused to finance this mine and yet the government is actually considering doing that? By the way, isn't that a kind of a socialist idea?
I just correct you there for a second, Tony. The government's not considering investing in the mine itself. I do think it's an important job of governments to build infrastructure in Australia, including rail infrastructure, along with, like the Labor government did in the Hunter Valley, a rail coal network we still own. If the investment went ahead and, as I say, no decision's been made, it would, of course, only be on the basis that other coal mines, other users in the area can use that rail line. That's what governments do, open up an area. This would be the first coal basin opened in our country for nearly 50 years. And there are 5 other mines there, and altogether they'd create 16,000 jobs, according to the Queensland Government Coordinator General. This is a massive opportunity for
Matt, I'm just going to pause you there for a minute. We want to hear from the other panellists, but also the questioner's got a hand up, so I'll go back to Nell Schofield.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about opening up this coal resource, which, if burnt, would double Australia's carbon emissions. We've already seen the death of half of our Great Barrier Reef. I mean, what is it about climate science you don't understand?
Well, Nell, I completely accept the climate science. We've got to do something about that. But it's important to note, or put these things in context, the world burns 6 billion tonnes of thermal coal a year. 6 billion tonnes. We in Australia mine 250 million tonnes in total. We're 4% of world production. The Carmichael mine, the Adani mine, is 25 million tonnes, 0.4% of world production. And I did disagree in your first question. You said it was low-grade coal. It's lower grades than the Newcastle coals north of here. I accept that. But it's 60% higher in energy content terms than average Indian coals. So this coal is going to India. It'll replace and displace coal. It's of a lower energy content.
OK, Matt,
that means fewer carbon emissions for the world.
Just so that other people can get involved, I want to hear from Terri Butler from the other side of politics. Now, the Queensland Labor government supports this. Does the federal Labor Party also support the mine?
Well, we've said very clearly that we don't want to see a $1 billion concessional loan going to this company for this rail line. I think most Australians, whatever their view about the project, think that giving a $1 billion concessional loan to this company is a terrible idea, particularly when there's so many infrastructure needs just crying out for support in Northern Australia. I was just telling the Senator before the show, I happened to do a charity bike ride from Cairns to Corumba up in North Queensland over the break, and we rode on the Newcastle Range, and it needs a lot of work. And if we're going to subsidise infrastructure, why don't we subsidise infrastructure that will actually have broad use for locals? I think that most people would rather see money going to that. And
can we clear up what the Labor Party's position? Just hang on a second.
Sorry, Tony,
can we just clear up what the Labor Party's position is? The federal Labor Party doesn't support the mine, is that correct? And the state Labor Party does. Is that
Tony, the role of federal Labor in relation to this project is to form a view about whether to support the federal money going into it. Bill's been really clear. We don't support federal money going to this mine. We don't support taxpayers' money going into this mine, whether it's the rail line or the mine. And we don't support a $1 billion concessional loan from the NAIF going into this particular project. And I think Bill's been clear about that. Jason Clare's been clear about that. I do think if we're talking about infrastructure, people are going to have some questions, even if you support the project. Are there any Australian firms that want to build the rail line, for example? Where is the NAIF process up to? Have any of the railway lines actually been referred off to Infrastructure Australia for consideration as the investment mandate for the NAIF requires? Where are we actually up to?
That's a series of questions you just asked, but of course that's a prerogative of the audience. So I'm just leave them hanging. Mehdi Hasan, I see you want to jump in there. So out of curiosity, what do you have to say about this?
Just listening to the Minister, a $1 billion loan for a mine. I think the company Adani has admitted in court that it will produce 1,500 jobs. Now, I'm no economist, but paying $680,000 per job seems like a waste of taxpayers' money. Surely you can create jobs in a much more efficient way. It's madness to spend $1 billion to create 1,400 jobs. That's from an economic point of view. From a climate science point of view, as the questioner pointed out, even bigger piece of madness. Climate change is the biggest existential threat that we face today. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull said 10 years ago that it's the biggest challenge facing the world. For him now, 10 years later, to be signing off on a mega mine that's only going to produce more coal. Clean coal. We always hear stuff about clean coal.
Well, it is clean coal.
Clean coal is like hot ice. It's a contradiction in terms. Coal is coal. It's dirty. You burn it, it produces carbon emissions. You can't meet your carbon obligations by burning more coal.
I mean, let's get serious here, right? We're sitting here in a town of Sydney, the biggest town in Australia, and as I say, 200 kilometres north, here is the biggest coal terminal in the world. Yet I don't hear anyone in New South Wales saying we should shut these coal mines down. New South Wales government's certainly not doing that. We in North Queensland, we've got unemployment of 11% in Townsville, and a small Aboriginal community near the mine, Warrabinda, unemployment, according to Patrick, who I just met the other day from the Wangan and Jagalingou peoples, unemployment is 75%. So Mehdi, it's easy for you to say 1,400 jobs, forget about it. I mean,
I didn't say forget about it.
Hang on.
I'm saying create more jobs in renewables.
Well, as I say,
with better infrastructure projects.
Hang on, as I said, this is opening up a whole coal basin. It's not about one mine. It's not about one company. It's about opening up an area of opportunity for our country that will deliver 16,000 direct jobs, according to the Queensland government. That's the direct jobs, right? And then there'll be other business and ongoing opportunities as well. I mean, that's why I'm passionate about it, because I'm passionate about trying to help the first Australians of this country who've denied opportunities for centuries, and now we want to tell them what to do there on their own land.
So do every Matt. Rachel, are you buying either of these arguments?
Well, I find it interesting because obviously there's, Matt's coming at it because there are obviously people in communities that he represents that need employment. And I understand why politicians come out and they can sell that message, because there are constituents that they need to represent, that in that area of Australia, those jobs are very important to those people. But I think it's very difficult for a lot of people who see the climate science and and sort of think to themselves, gosh, $1 billion invested into renewables might really help to bring down those prices that people keep talking about, or, to create jobs in an area that, you see in the States, the jobs in solar outweigh jobs in oil, coal and gas. And I think that people just feel a bit like, yes, you absolutely have to represent people and give them jobs, but at the same time, it just feels like we are behind history on this.
Well, that actually takes us to our next question, which is from James Newbold. James.
Hi. Renewable energy is more carbon efficient and now cheaper than coal and other fossil fuels. And with the advent of battery technology, may soon become more stable. But the transition to renewable energy risks jobs in vulnerable communities of National Party constituencies. So is there a way that we can transition to renewable energy in a way that doesn't include coal, but still includes jobs for those vulnerable communities?
OK, Matt, let's keep it brief.
Yeah, well, thanks, James. Look, I don't accept that renewables are at the moment cheaper than coal. That's not the advice the Australian government has, particularly when you look at the need for dispatchable power. Like, we need to have an electricity system which can provide energy on a permanent basis. And on that basis, coal is still probably the cheapest way of doing that. And the rest of the world are doing that. There's somewhere between a few hundred and more than 1,000 coal-fired power plants being built around the world.
So, Matt, just
we shouldn't be rejecting.
Matt, can I just pick you up on that? Because you've got a $5 billion infrastructure development fund. I think $1 billion roughly is going to go, if it happens, into this loan for the railway line.
That hasn't been decided.
You're also backing the building of a new high-intensity coal-fired power station in northern Queensland. How much would that cost? Because it's said that those Healy high efficiency, low emissions coal-fired power stations cost roughly $3 billion. That's pretty much all your fund, isn't it?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't. I think the figures you've quoted there, Tony, aren't necessarily correct. There's a lot of media speculation about.
That's what they cost in Japan.
No. Sorry, I meant on the rail line. On the rail line. Yeah, look, you're broadly right. A coal-fired power plant will cost somewhere between $2 or $3 billion. The NAIF. The Northern Australian Infrastructure Facility, however, only lends 50% of the debt of any project. I mean, let's wait and see what happens. All I think is we should look at all options. We shouldn't close our minds, particularly, to new technologies here, right? These high-efficiency, low-emission coal-fired power plants are new technologies. They do emit or do produce energy with emissions 25 to 30% lower than our existing coal-fired power stock. So they can produce cheap power,
How long would it take
fewer
to
emissions, and a reliable source of power too. I mean, what's wrong with that? I think. It's silly to.
Terry Butler is asking.
Terry
Butler is asking here, how long would it take to build? It's irrelevant.
Yeah, look, they do take a long time, but even more reason to start planning now because.
But the learning rate of solar and wind is so good.
You asked a question, Terry.
Well, the point that's been made to you is that they're becoming cheaper. Those sources of energy are becoming cheaper. Why would we sink billions into a new coal-fired power station that's going to take at least a decade to build? It's not going to ameliorate any issues right now.
Okay, I'm happy to answer the question, Terry. We should do it because I don't want to see what's happened in Victoria happens to the rest of the country. The shutting down of the Hazelwood coal-fired power plant, which
we're not talking about shutting anything down, Matt.
Can I? Yes, you are. In New South Wales. You're talking
about North Queensland, Matt.
In New South Wales, you will have a. Do you hear me?
I feel like I've listened to you a long time.
You've got a coal-fired power plant here, just north of here, which is bigger than Hazelwood, Liddell. It's due to shut in 2022. Now, I think we should be planning for what happens there. One of the problems we've had is we didn't plan for the closure of Hazelwood. It's led to a doubling of wholesale power prices over summer this year, putting massive risk and threats to jobs, particularly in the manufacturing sector. In my area, 130 people lost their job at the Boyne Island smelter earlier this year, directly because of those increases.
Now, Matt, can you hang on for 1 second? And Matt, I just want a quick follow-up before we hear from the other panellists. I mean, why should taxpayers pay for a private company to run a power station? Isn't that a kind of socialist idea?
First of all, that is not what we are doing just yet, but we are open to all suggestions. The second point to make is...
But if it's paid for from your fund, that's taxpayers' money.
I was going to get onto that, Tony. The second point to make is that all the renewable investments we're making at the moment are, of course, involving taxpayers' money. So your argument there applies to them just as well. I've got no problem with them. It's fair enough for governments to support investments in renewable technologies. And as I'll go back to the central point, I'm not afraid of governments investing in infrastructure. We're going to build an airport here in Western Sydney that's $5 billion. I think that's a good investment. It's a good investment for your town, expanding the economic opportunity in Western Sydney, a really important part of our country. But we should be looking at infrastructure right around our country, not just in our biggest...
OK, all right. Now, I just want to hear from John Stackhouse, who comes from Canada, and there's been a big debate about this in your country as well. How do you see this debate reflecting on what's happening in your country?
I have absolutely no idea.
well said as a Christian ethicist, but...
Well, the ethical questions have come to the surface, and that is, here's what we'd like to do, but here's what we can do, and so here's what we have to do. And politicians have to work with the real choices in front of them, not the ones that we wish they had. And the only way to enter a debate like this is to know what these two politicians know and other people know about the relative costs and benefits and possibilities. And that's sufficiently complex that a foreigner like me will be well to stay the heck out of it.
You may be right, although Mehdi didn't seem to worry too much about it.
Because I'm a citizen of this planet and I care about the future of this planet, and what we're not talking about in this panel, we're talking a lot about the economy. The reality is, even if Matt's numbers were right, and I'm not sure they are, the reality is there's a much bigger cost here, which is Australia can't meet its commitments under the Paris Climate Accord that it signed up in 2015 if it carries on burning coal.
Hang on.
Matt, you said it yourself. You said it's not just about this mine.
No.
We're going to open up the whole area. And that's the problem. You're going in the wrong direction on carbon emissions, not the right direction.
But, Mehdi, we're not burning the coal here. It's being exported to other countries. But
let them burn it. Okay.
Hang on. Well, OK, so you want to... Let's get to the core of this question then, right? You want to deny...
Please.
Oh,
OK, sorry.
Safe economy for Queensland.
Thanks, mate. Thank you, Michael. I mean, the presumption in your question, Mehdi, is that you want to deny hundreds of millions of people in India access to cheap electricity. The same thing your country has benefited from. Your country was built on coal and benefited from coal in the Industrial Revolution, but you want to deny that to 250 million Indians who don't have access to any electricity.
No, I want countries like Australia to lead the way. I want Australia, the UK, my country, the US where I now live. I want them to lead the way when it comes to switching to technology, switching power production to renewables, to zero emissions. Your leader, your Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, said it himself in 2010. We need to switch to an economy where all or almost all of our energy comes from zero emissions. Why don't you listen to your own leader?
No, that he believed in climate.
Okay. He believed it in 2010, he doesn't believe it now. Oh, well.
Guys, I'm just going to pause this discussion because we actually have a political question about Malcolm Turnbull. It's time to move along to that question. It's from Sue Corcoran.
My question for Matt Canavan. Do you think the Liberal Party will suffer at the next election as a result of the criticism of government policy by Tony Abbott? And do you think there's a chance of a resolution between Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull of their long-standing feud?
Well, thank you very much for that question, Sue. I think it's the truism in politics that the more you're talking about yourselves, the less that people will think you're doing a job that you're meant to be doing, and that's looking after others. And I would hope that all of us in the coalition, and I'm a member of the Nationals Party within the Liberal National Coalition, but all of us concentrate on what we're here to do. It's a very important job. I try and take my job very seriously, and there's enough to do without succumbing to criticisms of your colleagues or others in the media. You just got to get on with your job. So that's what I'm focused on. And to your second part of your question, can things be resolved or settled down? Well, look, I don't have an answer to that, Sue. I don't know. I can understand the pain that an ex-Prime Minister would go through, and I think Tony's been a remarkable contributor to public policy.
But he was pretty vocal. I mean, he really did tear Labor a new one for this exact behaviour. And I feel like he said, I'm not going to chip in from the sidelines, I'm not going to do anything. And I feel like he kept it quiet for a while. But then when the tide seemed to turn a little and we started to, the conversation, the right started to become not so demonised, and we sort of had Trump and Pauline Hanson, and all of a sudden I feel like Tony's gone, hang on a minute, I was before my time. This is the kind of stuff that I was saying, and I got ousted. So now all of a sudden he's chipping in from the sidelines.
I'm not going to try and sit here.
Of course you're not.
And analyse.
I mean, it's ridiculous. You never would. I'll leave it to others to commentate on the motives of particular peoples. I just want to
find a way to do the
OK, Matt, what about finding a way? Would promoting Tony Abbott back into cabinet be a way of settling this issue?
Well,
that's one of the questions that was asked by the...
Another way I certainly won't find a way is to start speculating on cabinet positions as a minister myself. That's duly a proper role for the Prime Minister.
Sure, but you have opinions. Can you imagine a way of actually settling what is now one of the longest running feuds in Australian politics, second only to Gillard-Rudd, and we know where that ended up?
But Tony, that goes back to my point that I've got a job to do. Right? I'm a minister in a government. I've got a portfolio that's very active, got big issues like the ones we were just discussing. It is not my job to start speculating on who else should go on the football team to go on the paddock, right? I've got to stick to my job. And I think, you know, if more of us just did that, we'd get a lot further in this.
It's not a football team in a paddock. It's about which one of them ends up on the Iron Throne.
But that's what it feels like, I think. You know, you say you want to do your job, but I really feel like people feel like we're stuck in the middle of political ambitions and career ambitions rather than people who want to look at running the country.
And it's a pretty unique situation. I mean, as a foreigner in your great country, I look at 5 prime ministers, 5 changes of prime ministers in 10 years in one country. Is it Rudd, Gillard, Rudd, Abbott, and now Turnbull, and now maybe Abbott again. Come on, Australia, there's 24 million of you. Can't you come up with anyone new? Better people? I mean, I just find this amazing that it's these guys are still fighting. I thought Italy was bad, but Australia is on a different level.
One of the most surprising things is that in both cases, that is the deposing of Rudd and Abbott, they happened before these people even finished their first term.
Yes.
That is one of the most surprising things about it. John, I know you don't really want to delve into Australian politics, but how does this look to an outsider? We've heard from Mehdi.
Well, from a Canadian point of view, it's really quite extraordinary. We tend to have longer-serving, more stable administrations. It may be because we're simply duller than Australians. But the simple political history of Canada over the last 30 or 40 years is of quite long-standing administrations and of pretty centrist rule, whether from the right or from the left. And so we haven't had the polarizing. And we also haven't had the colourful personalities to drive our politics the way you have. We have a colourful Prime Minister now who's long on charm. But the honeymoon's rapidly ending in Canada, and now we'll see how he leads.
Now, Terri, we mentioned Rudd Gillard. Is there any way out of this once this kind of feud gets its grip on a political party? Because obviously we're seeing a similar version of it with the government now.
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously I replaced Kevin in the Parliament, so I wasn't there by definition when it was happening. But, you know, the coalition has something that Labor didn't, and that is an immediate, direct historical precedent to have learned from. And I just don't understand why they haven't learned from it. But I think we are all sick of this kind of Game of Thrones style fighting over who gets to be the Prime Minister. It's a circus, and it's getting to the point where it's not just Malcolm versus Tony anymore. You've now got backbencher versus backbencher, with Craig Kelly saying that renewables kill people and Sarah Henderson out there saying that Craig Kelly's off the reservation, which is true. I mean, he clearly is. But they're just completely riven with sort of diabolical division, and people, I think, are sick of it. There's so many challenges. You know, we've got schools funding to actually continue to work towards. We've got higher education cuts on the back. Well, I don't agree with you that that's finished. We've got higher education cuts coming down the pipeline. We've still got a Medicare freeze. It's a $4 billion cut, Matt. Ask Simon Birmingham if you don't believe him.
Terri, I'm going to interrupt there because I know you've got a long list.
We have a lot of big problems.
Matt,
and I'd rather we focus on
I just want to hear one final answer from Matt, and that is, should Tony Abbott simply shut up now? Is that your position?
Look, I'm not. Again, I'm not in the business of giving, career advice to my individual colleagues. That would be counterproductive. I mean, that kind of behaviour would help to propagate the very thing I think we should focus on. So I just said before, we should focus on my job. Well, it's not my job to tell an ex-Prime Minister and a Member of Parliament how to do.
Well, your leader, Barnaby Joyce, doesn't mind telling people to hush up. You haven't quite got that level of confidence yet.
Well, I'm not the Deputy Prime Minister, so I'll stick to doing what I'm here to do.
All right, let's move on. The next question is from Demjan Doroshenko.
The professionalism of the Australian Defence Force to deal with terrorism should have been used in the Lindt Cafe siege, as they are far better trained than any police unit. The ADF have now been given these powers against terrorism, but why did they not already have them? Why does Australia have a gate-closed, horse-bolted approach to so many social issues we face like this?
Now, Mehdi, oddly enough, I'm going to start with you because I know you've actually been watching the press conferences over the past 24 hours. What's your view of this?
Well, the powers announced today, I think the Prime Minister said he wanted to give the military easier access to deal with terrorist attacks, shoot-to-kill policies. I'm all in favour of, taking out terrorists if they're in the midst of a terrorist attack. If innocent people are being threatened, I have no problem with law enforcement officials, counter-terrorism officials killing them. No problem at all. I'm a little bit uncomfortable about the idea of deploying the military in domestic security situations. In a modern democracy, I believe the military should be used for external defence, and the police do a very good job domestically. In the UK, where there was a horrific terrorist attack recently at London Bridge, within 8 minutes of the phone call being made to the emergency services, the police arrived on the scene and shot dead the 3 attackers. An amazing feat by British police, and hats off to them. The gentleman mentioned the Lindt Cafe. My understanding is even the state coroner, when he produced his report earlier this year, said, look, the military could have worked better with the police, but it wasn't really a situation that required the military to go in. And as I say, I think the police should be the lead on this. I think the Prime Minister did say that today. I'm uncomfortable about the idea of deploying the military as part of an anti-terror force domestically. The French have done it since the Paris attacks. Amnesty International came out with a report a few weeks ago about some of the excesses and human rights issues to do with that. And separately, I do worry about, I know we're going to talk about this later, I bet, but, this idea of kind of the fear of terrorism and living in a perpetual state of fear.
We will come to
But just one point on that in relation to this. Yep. Watching the Prime Minister today at those barracks, standing, surrounded, flanked by 6 Special Forces soldiers with masks on their faces. I mean, if that's not using the military for political reasons, if that's not politicising the military, I don't know what is. I found that a little bit uncomfortable for the Prime Minister to turn up with 6 commandos. They didn't need to be in that press conference with him. And there's a little bit too much use of the military there to make political points.
Terri Butler.
Yes, there's been a long bipartisan approach to not using the military for campaigning purposes, and it is important that we do continue to respect that. The fact is that people in the military are putting their lives on the line every day and deserve our respect and gratitude, and not to be turned into, not to be part of a backdrop of campaigning. Having said that, I have to say I was in committee hearings all day. I didn't actually get a chance to watch the press conference itself. I only saw the stills of it. But I know that there's a bit of discomfort being expressed in the community about the way that appeared.
What about the actual use of the military in terrorist situations, which is what's being canvassed here, obviously? I mean, the police, the Lindt Cafe, did not do their job at the final, when they went into the cafe, well enough to sustain an argument that the police should do this. That's what's being suggested.
Yeah, look, I'm not going to make any criticism of the New South Wales Police. Again, police officers...
But very specifically, does Labor support the idea of using the military, if necessary, in domestic terrorist incidents?
Yeah. So obviously this has been announced today. As I say, I didn't get a chance to see the press conference, but we're very, very far from seeing any sort of legislative change to consider. The principle is one that has obviously been canvassed before, and Bill, I think, has an open mind in terms of looking at suggestions to make Australia safer. We do try to take a bipartisan approach in relation to national security where possible. Having said that, that does not mean uncritical acceptance. And if you look at our record on national security, on every national security bill that's been before Labor, we have sought to make improvements and to really work hard to protect civil and political liberties in making sure that what you don't end up with is a sort of authoritarian, overly authoritarian response to the fear of terrorism, which of course just makes the country less free, which is counterproductive if the entire point of what you're doing is to ensure greater freedom for citizens through freedom from violence.
OK, let's hear from Matt Canavan.
Well, thanks, Tony. Just returning to Demjin's original question, which was really about why they didn't already have these powers. This is an environment where we've got to continually be vigilant in improving the framework we have to respond to these events. And I think we have a very effective framework, law enforcement system, intelligence gathering system, that thankfully has avoided a lot of threats. About 12 activities have been disrupted in the past 3 years by those authorities. But we've always got to be becoming more vigilant and not be complacent. And this particular change has been a recommendation coming out of the Lindt Cafe siege. And look, I take the points that Mehdi's making about historical use or you know, the purposes of different agencies. But I also, in this environment, seriously take the advice of the law enforcement officials about what they need to respond to what are very, very challenging threats.
And what about the point about using the military as a backdrop to a political announcement, particularly masked men?
Well, like Terry, I was busy today. I didn't see the press conference itself, but I think that seems a little bit over the top. I mean, this wasn't a campaign announcement or anything like that. It's quite often that we, you know, when the military involved in activities or what have you, we involve them because they're an important part of our community. I've got a large training activities with the American Army at the moment in central Queensland, and you know, the politicians often go up and talk to them and you know, thank them for the work they do. And I think that's what the Prime Minister was doing today. Thanking our special armed forces and our armed forces for what they do and what they sacrifice to protect us all.
All right, John, is the military used in this way in Canada, do you know?
Well, the military is used in a lot of different ways in Canada. As you know, we have a long-standing tradition of peacekeeping, and of which in fact amount to a kind of quasi-policing in other jurisdictions. But I think Mehdi's point's a crucial one, not only symbolically but practically. Police officers are trained not only to exert force, but to police, to make peace as peace officers. And soldiers generally aren't. They're trained in a different way to do a different kind of job. So it's both symbolically and practically very dangerous to mix the two.
Well, I mean, in this case, it seems specifically designed to get people who are used to killing other people, whereas the police in the circumstances of Lindt were not. So the idea is you find people who can do that job best.
Well, it seems if I look south of our Canadian border, there are plenty of police officers who are good at killing people.
All right. Now, remember, if you have any doubtful claims on Q&A, you can go to send a tweet using the hashtags FactCheck and Quandra. Keep an eye on our Twitter account, RMIT ABC Fact Check, and the Conversation website for results. The next question comes from Marco Princi.
Mehdi Hasan, you have stated that us Aussies have less to worry about than other Western nations. What makes you believe this? And as a journalist, what's your take on Islamophobia, as it is promoted by news, social media, and other types of information outlets?
Mehdi.
Wow, two big questions. Thank you. I assume your question about less to worry about is to do with terrorism, which I wrote about last week for ABC. Look, terrorism, I came to Australia to speak at the Crescent Institute, which is a thought leadership networking group in Sydney, and I spoke in Sydney, Melbourne last week. And what I said last week, and I'll say to you all, is this: terrorism is a deadly threat to our society, no doubt about it, to many of us in this room. But it's not an existential threat to our society, and it's not something we should spend our entire focus, our energy, our resources obsessing over, worrying over. I don't think we should live in perpetual fear of the next terrorist attack, partly because terrorist attacks are thankfully extremely rare, but also because that's what the terrorists want. The whole purpose of terrorism is to terrorise. It's to spread fear and paranoia and suspicion and division, to provoke an overreaction. Terry mentioned it earlier. And I think, you know, to make us do crazy things like invade Iraq or set up Guantanamo Bay, which just leads to more recruits for the terrorists. So my view is, if you really want to defeat the terrorists, don't play their game. Don't live in fear. Don't live in panic and terror. Recognise the threat. It is a threat. But, you know, 5 Australians have been killed on Australian soil over the past 20 years. That's 5 too many. But that's far fewer than are killed in road traffic accidents, in cases of domestic violence. As I wrote in my piece last week, you're more likely, the statistics show, you're more likely to be killed falling out of bed in the morning in Australia than to be killed by a terrorist later in the day in Australia. Now, a lot of politicians...
Well, you're saying it's absurd.
Mehdi,
you say in Australia, but of course, all Australians would know that 88 Australians were killed in Bali bombings.
Agreed.
That feels like it happened in our backyard.
Agreed.
For most Australians, feel like Bali is part of their life.
Yes, and even if you include the tragic deaths from Bali, even if you include terrorist attacks across the world, the point is that terrorism is a threat, but compared to the other threats we face, both international, geopolitical, and in our everyday lives, from crime, murder, etc., it isn't the threat that some politicians make it out to be. It isn't the threat that some people in the military industrial complex, whatever you want to call it, in security industry, make it out to be. That's what I'm trying to say.
But you wouldn't have said that after 9/11, would you?
Because
that was a pretty. That was a huge threat, and if you added to that,
so this is a very emotive subject. So of course, whenever you talk about this, no one's trying to disrespect anybody who's died. In fact, the opposite. We're trying to say don't allow those deaths to be politicised. But even 9/11, even the year of 9/11, if you include the deaths, I believe the chance of being killed by a terrorist in the United States in 2001 was 1 in 50,000. Over the next decade, it went to something like 1 in several million. I mean, you're more likely in the United States to be killed by your furniture falling on top of you than by a terrorist. I just want to put things in proportion.
I think that's really important, and from a statistical standpoint, that is true. But the way that terrorism makes people feel and the way that it is reported on the nightly news...
That's the problem.
You don't see an iPhone video of somebody crashing their car. You know, you're saying there are more people that die from car crashes. But you do see an iPhone video from inside a terrorist attack, and that's emotive, and people feel something, and it gets replayed over and over on the 24-hour news cycle.
You and I work in the media, and I would say that's part of the problem.
Exactly.
I think the media have acted as deeply irresponsibly over the last decade in terms, especially in terms of promoting these people, plastering their faces. A lot of these guys, they want their moment of infamy. They want their moment of notoriety. Let's not give it to them. Let's not play their game.
OK, let's hear from...
and I didn't get a chance to talk about Islamophobia, but hopefully later. Your second question.
Sorry, Mehdi, I don't really understand the relevance of that comparison. I mean, I haven't met a bunk bed that wants to establish a caliphate and destroy Western liberal values. I mean, there is a fundamental difference between a random act, or a random tragic act, you know, falling out of a bunk bed or having a fridge fall on you or something, and the considered ideological, strategic attempt to spread terror through our society.
How about domestic violence?
Well, again, that's not an organised. There are people within our community and overseas that hate Western society, that do not like liberal democratic values, and do see it as their fundamental goal to destroy them in very destructive and violent ways. Now, the best thing we could do, in my view, to stop that from happening is to stop the attacks from happening. And that's why all these law changes and extra resources we're giving to the police are so important. Because if, and let's hope it never happens, but if there are large-scale attacks of the nature that Mehdi's outlining, yes, there would be a risk to our values. Yes, that's what they want to achieve, and that's why we've got to fight so hard to make sure that...
We've just got a person through their hand up there. I'll just take that questioner. Go ahead.
What about the repercussions of terrorism in Middle East? I mean, if we're going to talk about this, and if it's a global issue, we have to approach it on a holistic view, right? So there is a global consequence to terrorism. It's not just a national threat. It's not just a threat in the West. And since the advent of 9/11, we have had at least 1.7 million people lose their lives in Middle East, in Afghanistan. So there is a cost of life on all scales, on all sides.
OK, I'm going to go right across the end of the panel here from John Stackhouse. John, you've been listening to this, and obviously there's a reflection on the nature of terrorism. There's a reflection on the level of paranoia and fear within Western societies about it, questions as to whether that's too much. What do you say?
Well, I think we've seen two things get confused and conflated here. One is acts of terrorism in Australia or the United States, which are the act of desperate people who have no other real means to press their political case, at least they don't think they do. And that amounts to the small-scale tragedy that Mehdi's talking about. When we start talking about hundreds of thousands of people being killed, we're not talking about military-scale engagement. This isn't terrorism anymore. Right? This is actually warfare. And wars...
Some of which occurred as a direct result of terrorism. So, in other words, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, they were in response to terrorist attacks.
Well, actually, the Iraq War wasn't in response to terrorist attacks. It was based on a bunch of lies about terrorism that didn't exist. Al-Qaeda wasn't in Iraq. We put Al-Qaeda in Iraq. ISIS wasn't in Iraq.
There was a lot going on, that's right.
You're saying that Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan didn't cause September...
I said Iraq. I specifically said... Tony mentioned the Iraq War, which is the biggest blunder and the biggest recruiting sergeant for terrorism in our lifetimes. That was fought on a false prospectus by the United States, the UK, Australia, Australia and
we know, I'm just talking about the context in which it happened.
But Iraq is an example for my argument, which is, look what happens when you go crazy, obsessed about terrorists under every bed. You go and invade countries where there's literally no ties to those.
All right, now we should go back.
And then you help the terrorists.
We should go back to John, because we interrupted his point.
What I'm worried about is that the common element between some of these acts of terrorism that we're worried about, that are really small scale, that really do occupy too much of our imagination and too many of our resources go there when they should go to other clear and present dangers domestically. The common element between the warfare we're talking about here and the terrorism that we're talking about here is Islam. And that really troubles me, because that lets people put the two together, because the common element is Islam, and that's what we're really worried about. And that concerns me, because I'm not worried about Islam. I'm worried about certain people who fly black flags in the name of Islam, and who disgrace Islam, and who press certain political agendas in the name of their religion. That concerns me, and I don't want to conflate those people with Muslims around the world and with geopolitical problems.
John, that actually leads us to a question we had in the audience. The question is from Roger French, who has a slightly different take on it.
Question for Mehdi. In view of the fact that in Australia, Muslim couples have a much higher birth rate than the rest of us, is it not possible that in a couple of generations, Australia could have a Muslim majority who vote in Sharia law? Further, if so, is it not possible that sects could develop, Sunnis and Shias, who begin bombing and shooting each other and turning currently the best country into the world like another war-torn Middle Eastern country? This is not Islamophobia, this is Sharia law phobia.
OK. I think there was a lot more than Sharia law in there. Let me just try and unpack your point. First off, I know Malcolm Turnbull said over the weekend that Australian law takes precedence over the laws of mathematics in this country. But I'm no mathematician. No, there's no way that the Muslims are going to form a majority in Australia in the next generation or two. I believe it's 600,000 or something in the recent census out of 24 million Australians. So you don't have to worry about Muslims coming in, taking over Australia, although Australian Muslims are doing a very good job. I've been met a lot of them over the last week.
You're not unfamiliar with these kind of questions in the United States. Where does it come from, this fear?
I think the fear comes from many areas. I think partly it comes from, of course, what we've been discussing, terrorist attacks. It would be mad to not talk about the fear that terrorism provokes and the absurd and horrific things that Muslims do in the name of, some Muslims do in the name of Islam, as John has already pointed out. But a lot of it, unfortunately, does come from media, social media these days. Misinformation. The gentleman here, I'm not sure how much you're aware of the differences between Sunnis and Shias. Are you aware of the differences between Sunnis and Shias?
Vaguely. I know they're at each other's throats. That's the main thing I know. They're all Muslim.
Not true. I'm Shia and my best friend is Sunni.
Well, I think
it's not true.
In a global context, there is a kind of truth to that, isn't there? I mean, Iran.
There's not. Sorry, Tom. There's not a truth to that. Actually, there's a geopolitical game in the Middle East where one Shia majority country and one Sunni majority country do want to kind of dominate the region. There's no doubt about that. But the idea that this is some kind of lazy Sunni-Shia split. In fact, in a country like Iraq, you mentioned war-torn countries in the Middle East. Iraq, a country torn apart by war, partly by its horrific dictator, partly by a Western coalition that involved Australia that went in to make it more war-torn, and today is riven by sectarian splits that didn't really exist before 2003. Pre-2003, Sunnis and Shias got married in Iraq, had sushi children, mixed children, right? So let's not... And today, I'm sorry to say, a lot of the sectarian divisions in the Middle East are geopolitical pushed by Muslims. A lot of them are pushed by foreign wars and foreign occupations, I'm sorry to say. So you don't have to worry. Sunnis and Shias, I have many friends who are Shia, many friends who are Sunni. We're not all at each other's throats. Please don't believe everything you read about us. Come and talk to us, meet us, make Shia and Sunni friends, and then you'll see that you don't have to worry about Sharia law or Sunnis or Shias.
OK, well, let's quickly go back to Roger. He wants to make a point, and then
I must say, Mehdi, your point is very good. I must say, though, that when you look at statistics and compound interest, which is a parallel case, numbers, when there's a certain increase every year, numbers skyrocket to very large numbers. So it's not quite as cut and dried as we would like to believe, that there cannot eventually be a Muslim majority, I think.
OK, I mean, I don't think that's the case. And let me just say one thing, because we're talking about this in a way as if a Muslim majority would be the worst thing in the world. I don't think Australia will have a Muslim majority, but having spent a week here with a lot of Australian Muslims, there are some amazing Australian Muslims, doctors, nurses, engineers, accountants. I meet Australian Muslims working in the Prime Minister's office. They're doing great work in your country. They're doing great work.
Let's hear. Thank you very much. Let's hear from an Australian Muslim. The next question is from Fahad Akund.
As a Muslim living in Australia, nothing is more alienating and makes me feel more un-Australian than being continuously judged for what I'm not and viewed only through the prism of security. Laws after laws are passed. We see further militarisation of the police force. As you guys mentioned, we'll pretty soon see army on the streets. Lack of judicial oversights when it comes to terrorism-related charges. Every day we see more and more infringement of our civil rights when it comes to minorities. Is it not possible this Islamophobic approach to terrorism will drive more young people to radicalism?
We'll come back to you, Mehdi, on this. I'd like to hear from the other side of the panel, Rachel, and then Matt.
I think the problem with terrorism being blown up in the media as much as it is that individuals, and the majority of individuals, don't have much experience with Muslims. For 600,000 in a population of 24 million, the majority of people probably don't have a great deal of Muslims in their life. So the only information they're getting is the information that they get from the internet and the 6 p.m. news. And as a consequence of that, I think absolutely, as Matt was saying, we need to be careful and we need to put things in place so that we can be protected against terrorist attacks. But we don't need to blow it up and say that these things are happening all the time. We should be looking at the statistics, because unfortunately, the people that end up copping it are everyday Muslims who are trying to go about their business in Australia, who aren't understood because people don't have a personal experience with them, and end up having to defend their moderate practice of a religion that is being radicalised. So I do feel for individuals in that situation, because I'm sure it is hard for you to be going through your life doing the best that you can and to feel like you constantly have to stand up and say, oh, by the way, I'm not one of those, I have to defend this religion. Not every Muslim should have to come out and defend the religion every time they have a conversation.
Matt. Thanks, Tony, and thanks for Rud for your question. I agree with a lot of what Mehdi said before about the great contributions that many Australian Muslims make to our society. In my town of Rockhampton is a fantastic and vibrant Islamic community that I have the honour of representing as Senator for Queensland and often communicating with. I mean, I would, though, I take the issue you have for Rud about the unfairness of some Australians who engage in discrimination and prejudice. But I'd also just counter that too, that my experience with the vast bulk of Australians is, in fact, we're very welcoming and harmonious people. Like on the whole. We're not perfect. And there are some of us who are bigots and racists, and we should condemn that behaviour. But it's also, it cuts both ways. You shouldn't be saying that, oh, Australia is a bigoted place on the basis of a few people or a few experiences. That's not true.
But that's his life experience. Like, you're fine as a white bloke sitting in a panel.
Can I just, Matt, I'm just going to pause you there. Okay, I'll come back to you. You had your hand up. So, I mean, do you have personal experience of Islamophobia or racism?
Pretty much every day.
How does it, well, describe what that's like.
It's like pretty much opening up the news and be like, whoa, that news report was like 99% racist. So, like, you wake up to it, you have, you're made to feel like you have to explain yourself. You have to explain to your colleagues, you have to explain to your family, you have to explain to your non-Muslim mates things that, not relevant to you. And going back to the same thing, like, a lot of time, I feel like our story has been told by the white people who kind of have no lived experience and kind of tell us how we should be grateful. And when in reality, it's just every day. Like, last week, we saw a news of there was 5 acid attacks on Muslims in a country where Mehdi Hasan's from within 90 minutes. And you haven't seen...
You're talking about Great Britain,
not Australia.
I'm just saying it's the same thing that's all across in every country nowadays.
OK, Mehdi.
Let me just first of all agree with Matt that I've been here a week now. Hugely welcoming country. Love this place. Let me say that very clearly. But the day after I arrived, a report came out last week from a bunch of universities about Islamophobic attacks in Australia. 243 verified Islamophobic incidents between 2014 and 2015. 2 out of 3 victims of the attacks were women. 80% of those women in headscarves. I find it always ironic that a lot of the criticism of Islam is about the treatment of women, that we're trying to save women, and yet the people who bear the brunt of Islamophobic attacks are Muslim women, which is a great tragedy and contradiction. But it's a real problem, and it's growing everywhere. I've come from the United States, where anti-Muslim bullying in schools is at record high. Attacks on mosques, on women in headscarves at record high. In the UK, the same again. Many people say Islamophobia drove Brexit in many ways, the fear of Turkey joining, Syrian refugees. So it is a kind of global problem right now. And you can say, well, it's to do with terrorism, it's to do with violence, it's to do with the reaction to ISIS, and I'm sure that's all part of it. But a lot of it is also driven by the bigotry that Matt rightly highlighted, by the misinformation that certain people get from social media in particular.
And just to take the point of Farhad earlier, do you believe that the frustration generated by that does actually cause extremism?
I don't think it causes extremism, but every expert on radicalisation extremism that I've interviewed, ex-CIA people, ex-FBI people, they all agree that if you alienate and marginalise an already alienated, marginalised community, especially young, angry male members of that community, and you say you're not welcome here, you're not part of this country, you will, of course, drive them into the arms of people who say, see, the West hates you. There is a war between Islam and the West. ISIS needs Islamophobia. ISIS thrives off of Islamophobia. It is the best recruiting sergeant for ISIS. The reason why Donald Trump is loved by ISIS is because he's an Islamophobe who pushes people into their arms. They say it themselves. They say, this guy's made our job easier for us. That's what the ISIS guys say.
Matt, I know you want to jump in, but I'm just going to go to John Stackhouse, because he obviously wants to jump in as well.
Where there is no knowledge, something else will rush in to take its place. Stereotypes, cartoons, terrible movies, those kinds of things will rush in. And as long as Australia, like Canada, has such an absence of serious education about Islam in the public school system, as long as religion is seen as something that we're so afraid of being dominated by because of our worries about Christians and the imperialistic past of Christianity in the West, and we overreact and then take religion right out of the curriculum entirely. We properly have taken religious rituals out of the public school system, but now we've evacuated it of any serious teaching about the world's religions, and where there is no knowledge, something else will take its place. So it's not as if the gentleman here is completely wrong about some Muslims wanting to impose Sharia. Most Muslims do, numerically around the world and through history, but probably very few who make their way to Australia or Canada do. But I don't know that unless I'm taught that. And I don't know the difference between Shia and Sunni and Druze and other forms of Islam and Islam-related religions, because no one's telling me in a way that I can take seriously as an honest broker. So it seems to me that the universities have got to take religious studies seriously as a real subject that has implications across the curriculum, and make it a teachable subject in our public schools, because if trained teachers don't tell us about Islam, Hollywood will, and that's a real problem.
Matt, you want to jump in?
I think that was an excellent point from John. However, I was just going back a point to the point Mehdi made about terrorism stemming from marginalised communities. I mean, the one point of evidence, though, that counts against that, Mehdi, is the point that was raised over here earlier, that the vast majority of terrorism fatalities in the past decade have been Muslims on Muslims in Middle Eastern countries. So clearly not in marginalised communities. They're not minorities in those communities, right?
No,
so,
agreed.
So there is something else here.
Agreed.
That's
we were talking about the experience in the West, and we're talking about recruits. Surely you're more worried about people going out from Australia to fight. Well, I was talking about that context. Obviously, different people in different parts of the world are driven by different factors to join horrific groups like ISIS. I was referring to people in the West.
But I don't think they're disconnected. There is, as John said earlier, I mean, there is a common thread here running through many of these terrorist attacks, and it's a radical, ideological interpretation of Islam, which I think is incorrect. I'm not an Islamic scholar, but I've spoken to John earlier, and I think he's right that it is a distortion. But that's what's driving it, and we've got to attack that battle of ideas, and we're not going to be able to defend our society and our community unless we stand up for our values. And our values are a liberal democratic society which believes in freedom of religion, freedom of the press, equality between the sexes, equality before the law. That's what we've got to defend. We are in a battle of ideas here we have to defend.
Would you, one quick question. I agree with you on the importance of ideas. Would you agree, therefore, that countries like Australia shouldn't, therefore, be supporting horrific governments in the Middle East that don't support those values, that do behave horrifically, that are dictatorships, that are incubators for terrorism? Australia supports countries like Saudi Arabia, which has done more to spread that ideology than any other country in the world. Tony Abbott lowered the flag when the last Saudi king died. So why not be consistent in spreading those values? Why support dictatorship?
Well, Mehdi, before earlier you were lambasting the Bush administration for going to Iraq, and one of if you whatever you thought of George W. Bush's policy, it was identifiably indirectly to try and partly spread democracy in the Middle East. That's what he wanted to do, to spread those values. Now, I don't think. Obviously, it hasn't.
Tell that to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
But hang on, Mehdi. That's why exactly why we shouldn't be doing that kind of stuff, because we shouldn't be going around meddling in other countries, right? It's not that would be counterproductive, as it's proven to be in the Middle East. So I agree with your point, but what we've got to do is make sure, let's just all focus on making sure we make this place as safe, as secure and as prosperous as...
OK, all right. Now, before I'll come to you in 1 second, because we've got a question you'll want to answer. Remember, you can join the discussion on Twitter and on Q&A Extra on Facebook Live and ABC News Radio straight after this program. Our next question comes from Emma Cleary.
Yasmin Abdel-Majid has certainly enraged the community with her comments. But after all, everyone makes mistakes, and aren't we all entitled to an opinion? Is Yasmin under attack from the media because of her comments, or simply because she is a Muslim woman with an opinion?
OK, we're talking about Yasmin Abdel-Majid, who, as a result of a pretty much campaign against her, has decided to leave the country. Terri Butler.
Well, look, we were talking about countering violent extremism before, and the connection between exclusion and people becoming radicalised, and the impact on people, young people, people of all ages. We're seeing sort of anti-Muslim comments in the press, and I think almost every Australian would have been horrified when there was a radio announcer recently who joked that Yasmin Abdel-Majid should be run over. I thought that was pretty horrific. I actually thought, though, that the other thing she said, which is that she called Yasmin a flea, was actually worse. We've also just had a One Nation candidate in Australia comparing Muslims to mosquitoes and saying that there should be, agreeing with a comment that there should be a spray against Muslims. I find these comparisons with insects that are all aimed at engendering disgust towards people who are different to us to probably be the most worrying aspect of what's happening right now. And you know, as we've already talked about, if you want to encourage more violent extremism, then the way to do it is to exclude and to make people feel as though they are hated and not part of the community. So I think when there's a sort of a campaign against one person or a failure to stand up against this sort of language, that does have wider ramifications we need to be aware of. And I also think, not to have a go at you, Matt, I don't know if you were there, but the Liberal Party conference in Queensland on the weekend voting to ban young Muslim kids from being able to wear headscarves to school is just another example of this idea of excluding and seeking to really characterise difference as being problematic, and we need to be really careful about that as well.
Rachel, I'd like to hear from you on the treatment of a fellow female journalist and commentator.
It's interesting because when I saw her tweet and I read the story in the paper, I looked at it and I thought, oh gosh, that's going to get that's problematic. But anyway, you sort of move on, and we've gone from sort of going, oh, I wouldn't do that, to stacks on piling. You should die. You're awful. Leave the country. Death threats. The social media vitriol that sort of gets fired up now, I think just completely clouds what should have begun as, I think that was wrong and you shouldn't have done it. That's it. And I think the problem is that the conversation now just barrels down. And when you have people in the media who then add fuel to the fire by saying comments like that, I get it. Sometimes in live broadcast, we make mistakes and we grab for the grab bag of things in our head and we pick the wrong thing. But if you pick the wrong thing and it's something like that, that's not adding anything intelligent to the conversation. And to turn around then and say, well, guys, don't you have a sense of humour? That's not funny. It's not funny. And it wasn't adding anything to the conversation. And I think if you say something like that, you have to turn around and say, you know what, I probably chose my words really poorly, instead of saying, well, you just don't like free speech. Well, if you really like free speech, then you have to be okay with people disagreeing with the fact that they didn't like the thing that you said. So we just have to be smarter in the way we converse.
The problem, of course, as you well know, is that it's not just the kind of shock outrage that we all feel, those of us who are on social media every day, that it's, if you're a woman on social media, you get it worse than anyone else. If you're a woman of colour on social media, you get it even worse than women. And if you're a woman of colour wearing a headscarf, then, you know, then the target's really on you. And I find it, I read somewhere there were 65,000 words, according to one study, have been published about this Yasmin Abdul-Majid in the last few months. 65,000 words in the press. When Terri was mentioning earlier the problems about education, healthcare funding, climate change, jobs, terrorism, international politics, and yet this is what everyone thinks is the biggest issue going on here.
Because people click on it.
Because
and
people
that's
click
what
on it, and it's bullying.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a young woman who, whatever you agree with her, don't agree with her. I think she came to this country as a one-year-old. She's an Australian citizen, lived here all her life, won awards here, and now you have politicians. I'm not sure if it was a member of a Matt party, but an Australian politician said she should go live in a Middle East dictatorship. Someone else said she should self-deport. I mean, that's nothing but racism, xenophobia and bigotry, nothing else. There's no point sugarcoating that. That's outrageous.
I also think it's really dangerous to play down the impact that a social media storm has on an individual.
Oh.
I've been at the centre of one before, and I'm not a Muslim, and I can't imagine what that additional pressure would do. But I was at the house with police. You know, it is terrifying. And as an adult, yes, you are just being attacked by people that aren't around you, but it can be all-consuming, and you can feel like you can't get out of the middle of it. So there's a lot of people that are in politics, in media, that have experienced this, and I think for her to leave the country and for people to say, oh, you couldn't hack it or you couldn't this, you don't understand that it does feel pretty awful on that side.
Let me go to John. You've heard about this story, obviously, that a young woman could be driven out of her own country effectively, or feel that she must leave for her own safety. What do you think about that?
Well, I feel like saying, meanwhile, in South Sudan, the lack of proportion is just staggering. I mean, we actually started the conversation tonight talking about big things. Giant expenditures involving tens of thousands of people. And I wonder how many viewers we lost because we went into the 7th, 8th, 9th minute talking about politics and costs and coal and so on. And Mehdi did his best to keep it lively, but still. And these are huge issues. Now, what's happened to this young woman is terrible. But I think, as you correctly say, that should have been 5 minutes. It should have been, I'm sorry, I said the wrong thing. We all shoot our mouths off when we shouldn't have. And that should have been the end of it. Because nothing really was affected by that. Huge things are at stake every moment. And our attention span is only about 3 minutes at a time. So we better use every one of those 3 minutes on something
But she's clearly become a lightning rod for something else. It's bigger than her.
It
it's about, as you mentioned earlier, the fear of Islam, the fear of brown people, the fear of women in headscarves. And what's really depressing, to come back to the earlier point about extremism exclusion, is Muslims, and I find this across the Western world, wherever I travel, you get told that, oh, look, you're living in a ghetto, you're not integrating, you're not stepping forward, you're not voting, you're not taking part. And then you have young Muslims come forward, step forward, take part, become activists, go on media. Oh, you're an extremist, you're an infiltrator, you're a radical, you're anti-Western. You can't win. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. And people don't know where to go.
Let's ask, do you agree with that, Matt? I mean,
I think John said it best when we've probably spent enough on this. I think.
Well, no, that's the last question we're dealing with. And the question is, do you have an opinion about the fate of this young woman?
I don't really know all the circumstances, sorry, Tony, to be frank. I saw her original tweet was quite controversial, of course, and you know, I don't think it's appropriate when people denigrate our armed services, particularly those that were, in this instance, an employee of the national broadcaster. I think there was another employee of yours or SBS a couple of years ago who did something similar, not a Muslim, not a woman, and he got the sack, I think. You know, look, I don't know the other...
Quick question, though.
What the general point?
You talked about it as denigration. I'm just... obviously, it was considered to be, but lest we forget...
Yeah, and linking...
So to use the sacred words is the problem.
No. Look, and I'm recollecting now, because it's not something I've spent a lot of time focusing on, but the tweet then directly linked that memorial to atrocities in the Middle East and Palestine and Syria that has nothing to do with the Australian Defence Force. So it was disrespectful. It was on our probably most sacred day as a country, right? And I think we do have certain things in our country we should cherish and should be sacred, and Anzac Day is one of those in my...
Were you as offended by colleagues of yours who told her to leave the country?
Look, honestly, Mehdi, I wasn't aware of that. I think let's... Yes, I think the general point we have been discussing, which is more important, is the complete loss of respect and politeness on social media. That is a huge problem in our society, in my view. We've gone from having conversations at the pub and face to face, which is, there's a certain amount of human restraint when you're talking to someone individually, to this online world where you can quote anonymously and it's just vitriol all the way through. I mean, I can't read my Twitter feed anymore. There's lots of those, my Adani friends who, like to say lots of different things, right? And it's just becomes, they've just completely destroyed it as a communication source because of a lack of respect, a lack of attempting to understand other people's point of view and a lack of engagement. So that point is definitely...
But your own conference did vote to ban headscarves, and I think this is why people are so concerned about the connection between One Nation and the Liberals in Queensland, and why, when I hear about rumours of preference deals, it really worries me, because you've got these quite radical right-wingers who, as I say, you've got the chap up in the North Coast who compared Muslims to mosquitoes. When is the Liberal Party a mainstream
I'm sorry, I'm going to... I'm sorry, only because we're out of time, am I throwing up my hands here. I'm going to give Mehdi, as a visitor, the last 30 seconds.
The last 30 seconds to deal with this topic again?
Yeah. Well, I thought you might want to...
I mean, look, I agree with John. Let's all agree, I think, that... Look, we have to discuss it because it's a current affairs show, but I think we all agree that the story itself has taken up too much of our time. I think it is a lightning rod for other things. I think it is disturbing when politicians, and not this politician, but other politicians and people on the media, social media, are saying outrageous things about a young woman who can't defend herself and is having to leave the country. And by the way, as a Brit, can I just point out, people say, oh, she's running away. A lot of you Australians came to Britain long before Yasmin Abdul-Majid did. And long may it continue, but, that's a tradition.
You did send a few over here as well.
Yeah, let's not get into that now. I don't think
let's not get into that. That, in fact, is all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, John Stackhouse, Terri Butler, Mehdi Hasan, Rachel Corbett and Matthew Canavan. Thank you very much. Remember, you can continue the discussion on Q&A Extra with Tracy Holmes and Reverend Bill Cruz from the Exodus Foundation. They're taking comments on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live as soon as we finish. Now, next week, Q&A is live from Melbourne. It's our very first school special with high school students on the panel. The entire Q&A audience will be made up of secondary school students from across Victoria. We asked students to send a video audition for a spot on the panel. We received over 250 videos. So thank you to everyone who sent their auditions. It was a tough choice. Here are the 4 winners.
One of my biggest passions is the political and economic world, whether it be through Twitter, the newspapers, or the nightly news.
I'm young, I'm a feminist, I'm Indigenous, and I'm also part of the LGBT community. I was recently elected the first female Prime Minister of the Indigenous Youth Parliament.
I'm a rural teenager. I've lived in a small country town called Canavan, 1,000 people my whole life.
I would deal with the issues by being a millennial, not the insecure, spoiled snowflakes the media paints us out to be, but rather the empathetic, curious and outspoken young people I know we are.
Well, I think you can see why they won, and you can see them live on the panel next week, along with the Environment Energy Minister, Josh Frydenberg, and the Shadow Health Minister, Catherine King. So until next week's Q&A School Special, good night.
Still got something to say? Join the discussion on Q&A Extra now on ABC News.